March 1945. The Western Front is in chaos. In Berlin, deep beneath the city in the Fuhrer bunker, Adolf Hitler receives a phone call that will haunt him for the rest of his life. The message is short, but devastating. General George S. Patton's Third Army has just smashed through an entire German army group in less than 24 hours, and 50,000 Wehrmacht soldiers are now American prisoners. For 8 seconds, Hitler is silent. His hand trembles on the receiver. His generals watch, knowing that something fundamental has changed. This is the story of the day the Third Reich realized it was facing a force of nature it could never stop. By March 1945, Nazi Germany was bleeding out on 2 fronts. The Soviets were grinding forward in the east, but it was Patton's rampage in the west that truly broke the German high command's spirit. Unlike Eisenhower's careful planning or Montgomery's methodical advances, Patton's Third Army moved like a wildfire, fast, unpredictable, and utterly relentless. Patton's approach was simple: never stop, never wait, never give the enemy time to regroup. His armored columns would probe German lines, find a weak spot, and punch through before the defenders could react. Once through, they'd wheel around, encircle entire divisions, and cut off all hope of retreat. German commanders, used to fighting methodical enemies, found themselves outmaneuvered at every turn. The psychological impact was immediate. German soldiers began to talk about Patton panic. Units that might have held against other Allied commanders abandoned their positions at the mere rumor that the Third Army was approaching. The speed of Patton's advance created a domino effect. Retreat bred more retreat, and surrender became preferable to fighting a battle that seemed already lost. Deep in Berlin, Hitler's daily reports became more desperate. The numbers were staggering: tens of thousands of prisoners, entire army groups vanishing from the maps. Hitler's belief in miracle weapons and the superiority of German arms was being shattered by the relentless advance of Patton's tanks. But what made Patton's tactics so devastating? It wasn't just the speed or the firepower. It was the way he broke the rules of conventional warfare. Patton had studied military history obsessively, from the campaigns of ancient Rome to the battles of Napoleon. He believed that the key to victory wasn't killing every enemy soldier, it was breaking the enemy's ability to coordinate, communicate, and maintain cohesion. An army that couldn't operate as a unified force was just a collection of frightened men waiting to surrender. Patton's Third Army operated on principles that seemed almost reckless to conventional military thinkers. When other commanders would pause to consolidate gains and protect supply lines, Patton would order his forces forward, accepting risks that made his superiors nervous. He understood something crucial: the psychological advantage of momentum was worth more than perfect logistics. A defending enemy facing relentless pressure makes mistakes, loses cohesion, and eventually breaks. The Germans called it war of movement, but Patton took it to extremes they couldn't match. His armored divisions would advance up to 50 miles in a single day, racing past German strongpoints, cutting communication lines, and creating chaos in the rear areas. By the time German commanders realized where the main thrust was coming, Patton's forces had already moved on to the next objective. This approach required an extraordinary level of coordination and aggressive junior leadership. Patton handpicked commanders who shared his philosophy of speed and violence. He gave them broad objectives rather than detailed orders, trusting them to exploit opportunities as they emerged. When a German defensive line showed weakness, local commanders had authority to attack immediately without waiting for approval up the chain of command. The result was an army that operated inside the German decision cycle. By the time Wehrmacht commanders identified a threat, coordinated a response, and issued orders, the situation had already changed. Patton's forces would be miles away, attacking a different objective, while German reinforcements moved toward empty positions. For German soldiers facing this onslaught, the experience was psychologically devastating. They weren't just losing battles, they were losing any sense of control over events. Defensive positions that should have held for days were overrun in hours. Retreat routes that seemed secure in the morning were cut by evening. And everywhere, the unstoppable momentum of the Third Army grinding forward. The mass surrenders of early 1945 weren't spontaneous events. They were the result of systematic destruction of German military capability that had been building for months. When tens of thousands of Wehrmacht soldiers laid down their arms in rapid succession, it represented the final collapse of an army that had been pushed beyond its breaking point. The German soldiers surrendering to Patton's forces came from units that weeks earlier had been considered combat effective. They weren't poorly trained conscripts or reluctant foreign auxiliaries. Many were veterans of the Eastern Front, men who had survived the brutal warfare against the Soviet Union, yet they chose surrender over continued resistance. And that choice tells us everything about what Patton had accomplished. Several factors converged to create the conditions for mass surrender. First, the complete breakdown of German logistics meant that many units were operating without adequate ammunition, fuel, or food. Soldiers can't fight without bullets, and tanks can't maneuver without gasoline. Patton's rapid advances had severed supply lines faster than the Germans could establish new ones. Second, the destruction of German communications meant that many units were operating blind, without clear orders or awareness of the larger tactical situation. Junior officers found themselves making life and death decisions without guidance from higher command. When faced with the choice between fighting to the death in an apparently hopeless situation or surrendering to preserve their men's lives, many chose surrender. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the speed of Patton's advance created a pervasive sense that resistance was futile. German soldiers could see that defensive lines behind them had already been overrun, that retreat routes were cut, and that American forces would simply bypass and surround any position that tried to hold out. The calculation became simple: surrender now, while it's possible, or die in a battle that won't change the outcome. Deep beneath Berlin, in the claustrophobic world of the fur bunker, Hitler's daily routine had become a cycle of bad news and desperate hope. By March 1945, the reports from the Western Front were almost incomprehensible in their scale. Patton's Third Army wasn't just winning battles, it was making traditional warfare impossible. Entire German army groups were vanishing from the maps, and the numbers of prisoners taken by the Americans were so high that even the most loyal staff officers struggled to explain them. Hitler's relationship with reality had always been complicated, but now the gap between his expectations and the actual situation was a chasm. He still clung to fantasies of miracle weapons, of political divisions among the Allies, of the fundamental superiority of German arms and tactics. But the news from Patton's sector challenged all of these delusions at once. When Field Marshal von Rundstedt's staff tried to brief Hitler, they chose their words carefully, knowing that the wrong phrase could trigger one of his infamous rages. How do you tell the Führer that entire army groups have simply evaporated? That divisions marked on his maps no longer exist as fighting forces? That German soldiers are surrendering in such numbers that American units are struggling to process them all? The day the mass surrenders peaked wasn't marked by a single dramatic event, but by a growing realization: the Western Front had ceased to exist as a coherent defensive line. Patton's forces weren't just advancing, they were erasing the very concept of a front. His Third Army had captured over 140,000 German soldiers in less than 2 months, with some days seeing tens of thousands surrendering as entire sectors collapsed. Hitler's response, according to those present in the bunker, followed a predictable pattern. First came denial, insisting the reports were exaggerated or that the soldiers were cowards. Then came rage, directed at his generals for supposed incompetence. He demanded counterattacks from divisions that no longer existed, reinforcements from armies that had already been destroyed. But beneath the fury was something new: genuine fear. Hitler understood military mathematics, even when he refused to accept their implications. The rate at which Patton was destroying German forces in the West meant that soon, nothing would stand between the Third Army and the heart of Germany. And unlike the Soviets, whom Hitler still believed he could negotiate with, he knew the Americans would accept nothing less than unconditional surrender. The psychological impact on the Nazi leadership was profound. The reports from the front were not just numbers, they were the death knell of the regime. Hitler's obsession with holding every inch of ground, his refusal to allow tactical retreats, and his insistence on impossible counterattacks had created the conditions for catastrophic defeat. The generals in the bunker knew it, even if Hitler could not admit it. As the days passed, Hitler's reactions became more erratic. He blamed his generals for cowardice, his soldiers for lack of willpower, even the German people themselves for being unworthy of his leadership. He could not acknowledge that he was facing a commander who had studied warfare with the same intensity Hitler had once brought to politics and who had created a military machine specifically designed to shatter the kind of defensive warfare Germany was attempting. To understand why Patton's Third Army was so devastating, you have to look beyond the headlines and casualty counts. Patton's genius wasn't just in his aggression or his love of speed, it was in how he built a system that could outthink, outmove, and outfight the enemy at every level. His approach to command was radically different from the German model, and it was this difference that broke the Wehrmacht's back in the West. Patton believed in what he called the relentless pursuit. He didn't want to win battles by attrition or by grinding down the enemy in set-piece engagements. He wanted to break their will to fight, to shatter their ability to coordinate, and to make every German soldier feel hunted, isolated, and hopeless. The key to this was momentum. Patton's orders to his tank commanders were simple: never stop, never wait for infantry, and never give the enemy time to regroup. If you hit resistance, probe for a weak spot, punch through, and keep going. This philosophy required a new kind of leadership. Patton handpicked aggressive, flexible officers who understood his intent and could act on their own initiative. He gave them broad objectives, not detailed instructions, and trusted them to exploit opportunities as they arose. When a German defensive line showed weakness, local commanders had the authority to attack immediately, no waiting for approval from above. This decentralized command structure allowed the Third Army to move faster than the Germans could react. The result was an army that operated inside the German decision cycle. By the time Wehrmacht commanders identified a threat, coordinated a response, and issued orders, Patton's forces had already moved on to the next objective. German reinforcements often arrived at empty positions, while American tanks were miles away, attacking somewhere new. This constant pressure created confusion, panic, and a sense of futility among German troops. Patton also understood the psychological value of momentum. He knew that a defending enemy facing relentless pressure would make mistakes, lose cohesion, and eventually break. The Germans called it war of movement, but Patton took it to extremes they couldn't match. His armored divisions could advance up to 50 miles in a single day, bypassing strong points, cutting supply lines, and encircling entire divisions. Communication lines were severed, and before German commanders could coordinate a response, they found themselves surrounded by American armor. The impact on German morale was devastating. Soldiers who had once believed in the superiority of German arms and tactics now found themselves surrendering in droves. The speed of Patton's advance created a cascading collapse. Retreat bred more retreat, and surrender became preferable to fighting a battle that seemed already lost. The mass surrenders of early 1945 were not spontaneous. They were the result of a systematic campaign to destroy the enemy's ability to function as a unified force. Patton's Third Army didn't just win battles, it made traditional warfare impossible. The Germans were left with no good options: fight and be destroyed, or surrender and survive. On the ground, the collapse of German resistance in the face of Patton's Third Army was as much about logistics and morale as it was about firepower. By March 1945, the German army in the West was running on fumes. Ammunition was scarce, fuel was almost non-existent, and food supplies were dwindling. Patton's rapid advances had severed supply lines faster than the Germans could establish new ones. Entire units found themselves cut off, unable to communicate with higher command, and forced to make life or death decisions on their own. For many German officers, the choice was stark: fight to the last man in a hopeless situation, or surrender and save the lives of their men. Increasingly, they chose surrender. The mass capitulations that followed were not the result of cowardice, but of a rational calculation. With no ammunition, no fuel, and no hope of reinforcement, resistance was futile. The Americans, for their part, often gave surrounded Germans a simple ultimatum: surrender now, or face overwhelming artillery and tank assaults. Most German commanders made the only decision that made sense. The speed of Patton's advance created a sense of inevitability. German soldiers could see that defensive lines behind them had already been overrun, that retreat routes were cut, and that American forces would simply bypass and surround any position that tried to hold out. The calculation became simple: surrender now while it's possible, or die in a battle that won't change the outcome. The psychological toll was immense. German soldiers who had survived the Eastern Front, who had fought the Soviets to a standstill in the worst conditions imaginable, now found themselves surrendering to an enemy who seemed to be everywhere at once. The old certainties, discipline, training, the belief in German superiority were gone. In their place was a sense of helplessness, a a realization that the war was lost, and that survival was the only goal left. The numbers tell the story. In less than 2 months, Patton's Third Army captured over 140,000 German soldiers. Some days saw tens of thousands surrendering as entire defensive sectors collapsed. By the time the war ended in May 1945, the Third Army had taken more than 650,000 prisoners, more than any other Allied army. For Hitler, the reports of these mass surrenders were the final blow. The Wehrmacht was supposed to be ideologically motivated, trained to fight to the death for the fatherland. Instead, his soldiers were surrendering in numbers that exceeded even the worst defeats on the Eastern Front, and they were surrendering to Patton, the American General Hitler had identified as the most dangerous Allied commander. In the bunker, Hitler's response was a mix of denial, rage, and scapegoating. He blamed his generals for cowardice, his soldiers for lack of willpower, even the German people themselves for being unworthy of his leadership. What he could not admit was that he was facing a commander who had mastered the art of modern warfare, who had built a military machine specifically designed to shatter the kind of defensive fighting Germany was attempting. By the spring of 1945, the myth of German invincibility was in ruins. The Wehrmacht, once the terror of Europe, was now a collection of battered units surrendering en masse to Patton's Third Army. The speed and violence of Patton's campaign had done more than just win battles, it had broken the psychological backbone of Nazi Germany. Inside the fur bunker, Hitler's world was collapsing. The reports from the Western Front were relentless, entire army groups gone, divisions erased from the maps, tens of thousands of soldiers surrendering in a single day. Hitler's response was a tragic mix of denial and fury. He raged at his generals, accused his soldiers of cowardice, and blamed the German people for failing him. But beneath the anger was something new: fear. For the first time, Hitler understood that the war was lost, not just on the battlefield, but in the minds of his own troops. Patton's achievement went beyond tactics or even strategy. He had fundamentally changed the psychology of warfare on the Western Front. His relentless pursuit, his willingness to take risks, and his trust in aggressive junior leadership created an army that moved faster than the enemy could react. The Germans, trained to fight set-piece battles and hold ground at all costs, found themselves outmaneuvered at every turn. Defensive lines that should have held for days were overrun in hours. Retreat routes that seemed secure in the morning were cut by evening. The mass surrenders of March 1945 were not just a military event, they were a watershed moment. German soldiers, many of them veterans of the Eastern Front, chose surrender over continued resistance. They weren't poorly trained conscripts or reluctant auxiliaries. They were experienced fighters who had survived the worst the war could offer. But Patton's campaign had created conditions where resistance seemed pointless. The calculation was simple: surrender now, or die in a battle that wouldn't change the outcome. For Hitler, this was the ultimate betrayal. The Wehrmacht was supposed to fight to the last man, to hold every inch of ground, to die for the fatherland. Instead, they were laying down their arms in numbers that dwarfed even the worst defeats against the Soviets. Patton had proven every Nazi assumption wrong. He had shown that American soldiers were not soft, that American commanders were not cautious, and that American industry could outproduce and outfight anything Germany could throw at them. The 50,000 prisoners taken in a single day, or the 650,000 captured by the Third Army by war's end, were more than just statistics. They were the final proof that Nazi military doctrine had failed. Hitler had built his armies to conquer through Blitzkrieg, only to watch them destroyed by an American general who had perfected lightning war beyond anything the Germans had achieved. In the end, what Hitler said in those final weeks matters less than what his words revealed. Isolated, delusional, and desperate, he was forced to confront the reality that he had met his match in George S. Patton Jr., a commander who understood modern warfare better than anyone in the German high command. Patton's refusal to fight any war except the one he knew he could win accelerated the end of the Third Reich. The lesson of Patton's campaign is clear: victory is not just about firepower or numbers. It's about speed, coordination, and the ability to break the enemy's will to fight. Patton didn't just defeat the German army, he shattered the myth of Nazi invincibility and proved that the true power of an army lies in its ability to adapt, innovate, and strike without hesitation. Rehook, if you found this story of Patton's unstoppable advance and the collapse of Nazi Germany compelling, please like, comment, and subscribe for more deep dives into the moments and leaders that changed the course of history. And let us know in the comments, what do you think was Patton's greatest strength as a commander?